You'll just end up disappointed if you rely on others. Believe me, I know. You see, this thing is a lot more reliable than any person.
Than people?
This is the entire story of Steve Burnside, a boy who lost everything at a very young age. Long before Rockfort Island, long before the outbreaks, and long before he met Claire Redfield, life had already taught Steve a painful lesson, that trusting people only leads to disappointment. So he learned to keep his distance, to rely on nobody but himself, and to never expect anyone to come back for him. Because before Steve ever faced the horrors of Rockfort Island, his life was already falling apart. Unlike many of Resident Evil's survivors, Steve wasn't some highly trained Special Forces officer. He was just a kid who spent much of his childhood feeling alone. Although Steve was naturally kind-hearted, he often struggled to connect with the people around him. The love and support most children took for granted was something that Steve rarely experienced, leaving him isolated and deeply insecure. And unfortunately, things would only get worse. At the time, Steve's father worked as a low-level employee for Umbrella Corporation. For years, the Burnside family lived relatively normal lives, but in 1998, everything changed. Driven by greed, Steve's father made a decision that would destroy their family forever. He attempted to sell Umbrella's secrets to the highest bidder. It was a gamble that quickly backfired, because Umbrella didn't forgive betrayal. They punished it ruthlessly. When the company discovered what he had done, they responded immediately. Steve's mother was murdered, his father was arrested, and Steve himself was taken prisoner alongside him. And just like that, his home, his family, and his future were all gone. Soon afterward, Steve and his father were transported to Rockfort Island, a remote prison controlled by Umbrella. Upon arrival, the two were separated and imprisoned, left to rot as examples of what happened to anyone who crossed the corporation. And Steve could never bring himself to forgive his father. As far as Steve was concerned, his father had destroyed everything, and now anger had consumed him. But beneath that resentment was something even more painful: disappointment, because the one person Steve trusted most had failed him, and that realization slowly changed him. After the months passed, Steve became increasingly bitter and withdrawn. He stopped expecting help from other people, and stopped believing anyone would come to save him. If trusting someone could lead to this much pain, then trusting people simply wasn't worth it. So, Steve built walls around himself. Walls of sarcasm, arrogance, and anger. And unfortunately for Steve Burnside, Rockfort Island was about to show him that things could always get worse. After months of imprisonment, Rockfort Island descended into chaos when a rival organization launched an attack on the facility. Explosions tore through Umbrella's defenses, bioweapons escaped containment, and the T-virus began spreading across the island. Almost overnight, the prison became a graveyard. For Steve Burnside, however, the outbreak also presented something he hadn't had in months, being a chance to escape. After breaking free from his cell, Steve disappeared into the chaos and began navigating the island alone, and it wasn't long after before he encountered another survivor, being Claire Redfield. Their meeting was far from ideal. Mistaking Claire for one of the infected, Steve nearly attacked her before she quickly defended herself, shooting out the light he had trained on her. Realizing his mistake, Steve reluctantly introduced himself before quickly moving on. At the time, he wasn't looking for friends or allies. He was looking for a way off the island, and as far as Steve was concerned, he could handle that himself. Throughout all their early encounters, Steve constantly kept Claire at arm's length. He disappeared whenever he had the chance, acted dismissive, and often came across as arrogant. But beneath all of that was something else: fear. Because every time Claire tried to get close, Steve was reminded of something he'd spent months convincing himself: people will always let you down. That mindset became especially clear when Claire discovered Steve researching information about Chris Redfield through Umbrella surveillance systems. After learning Chris was Claire's brother, Steve watched as she immediately searched for a way to contact him. To Claire, it was obvious. If Chris knew that she was alive, he would come. But Steve couldn't understand that kind of faith. After all, nobody had ever come back for him. So when Claire sent a message to Leon Kennedy asking him to contact Chris, Steve dismissed the idea entirely. He told her Chris wasn't coming, that relying on other people would only lead to disappointment, and then he stormed out. At first glance, it sounded cruel. But in reality, Steve wasn't talking about Chris, he was talking about himself. Because deep down, Steve had already convinced himself that depending on people only led to pain. And yet, no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from Claire, he kept finding reasons to come back. Whether it was trying to prove himself, or constantly competing for her attention, Steve was slowly becoming attached to the one person he claimed he didn't need. And eventually, that attachment revealed itself during one of the most dangerous moments on Rockfort Island. When Claire found herself cornered by a Bandersnatch, it seemed like she was out of options. But then suddenly, Steve burst through a nearby window and opened fire. Without hesitation, he risked his life to save hers. Of course, Steve immediately tried to play it cool afterward, but the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The boy who claimed he trusted nobody was starting to care about someone again. As the two continued their escape, they found themselves trapped beneath the island after the governor of the island, Alfred Ashford, attempted to leave them for dead. Forced to fight their way through hordes of zombies, Steve once again fell back on his old habits. At one point, he even remarked that his submachine guns were more reliable than people. It was a joke, but it was also the truth, or at least the truth he wanted to believe. But then, everything changed. As the two continued their escape, both Steve and Claire eventually fell into the ruins below. Claire became trapped beneath fallen debris, and Steve managed to get back to his feet. And that's when he saw him, his father, or rather, what remained of him. Months of imprisonment and exposure to the T-virus had transformed the man into a zombie. For a moment, Steve froze. Despite all the anger and resentment, this was still his father, the man he blamed for ruining his life. Unable to pull the trigger, Steve simply stood there as the infected man slowly approached. But then, the creature turned toward Claire, and suddenly, Steve was forced to make an impossible choice. With trembling hands, he raised his weapon and fired. The bullets tore through the infected man. And just like that, the last member of Steve's family was gone. Umbrella had already taken his mother. Now it had taken his father too. And this time, Steve was the one forced to end it. Afterward, Steve finally opened up to Claire about his past, and for perhaps the first time since arriving on Rockfort Island, he allowed himself to be vulnerable. And in that moment, something began changing inside Steve. The walls he had spent months building around himself were finally starting to crack. But before either of them realized it, their nightmare was only beginning. After an intense confrontation with Alfred, the pair managed to escape Rockfort Island aboard a transport plane. Finally, freedom seemed within reach, but unknown to either of them, Alfred had activated the aircraft's autopilot system before their escape. Instead of carrying them to safety, the plane was flying directly toward another Umbrella facility, one that was buried deep within Antarctica. And it was there that Steve's story would take its most tragic turn. After arriving at their destination, the nightmare began all over again. The Antarctic base had already fallen into chaos. The infected roamed the halls, Umbrella's experiments had escaped containment, and somewhere beneath the frozen facility, a far greater threat was preparing to awaken. As Claire and Steve searched for a way out, they once again crossed paths with Alfred Ashford. When Alfred held Claire at gunpoint, Steve immediately opened fire. The bullets slammed into Alfred, sending him staggering backward until the railing behind him gave way. Moments later, Alfred disappeared into the darkness below. For perhaps the first time during the Rockfort incident, Steve wasn't trying to prove himself. He wasn't acting tough, he wasn't pretending to be fearless, he was simply protecting someone he cared about. And throughout Antarctica, that pattern continued. When a grotesque creature known as Nosferatu attacked them outside the facility, Steve nearly lost his life after being thrown from a rooftop. Dangling over a frozen abyss, he found himself completely helpless. And this time, it was Claire who saved him. After pulling him back to safety, the two continued forward together. And it was after this that Steve made one of the most important promises in his entire story.
I swear I'll protect you next time, Claire.
It's a simple line, but it reveals just how much he had changed. Because for the first time in years, Steve was no longer thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future. A future where he and Claire escaped together. A future beyond umbrella and beyond loss. For the first time in his life, Steve had hope. But unfortunately, Resident Evil has never been kind to people with hope. Eventually, the pair discovered a transport truck and attempted one final escape from the facility. Freedom was within reach, but then Alfred Ashford made one final move. Before dying, he managed to awaken his sister, Alexia Ashford, one of Umbrella's most dangerous creations. Within moments, their escape was destroyed. The truck was reduced to wreckage, and both Claire and Steve were captured. What happened next would seal Steve's fate forever. Imprisoned by Alexia, Steve became the latest victim of Umbrella's obsession with biological experimentation. Without hesitation, she injected him with the T. Veronica virus, the same virus responsible for her own transformation. Claire could do nothing but watch. And then the mutation began. Steve's body twisted, his muscles expanded, his mind started slipping away. Every second, another piece of him disappeared. And soon, the frightened teenager who had survived Rockfort Island was gone. In his place stood a monster, a living weapon, a victim of Umbrella's endless pursuit of power. Consumed by the virus, Steve turned against Claire, the same Claire who had saved him and believed in him, and the same Claire who had become the most important person in his life. Cornered and defenseless, Claire could do nothing but watch as the mutated Steve raised a massive axe above his head. One swing, that was all it would take, and everything they had survived together, this would be how it ended. But then, something incredible happened. Steve fought back. Not against Claire, but against the virus, against the mutation, and against the monster he was becoming. Somewhere beneath all the pain, Steve Burnside was still in there. At the very last second, he regained control and redirected the attack, smashing into Alexia's pod instead of Claire. Even as the virus destroyed his body, he still couldn't hurt her. In the end, Steve chose Claire. Moments later, the battle was over. The mutation began fading and the monster disappeared, and all that remained was a dying 17-year-old boy. As Claire rushed to his side, Steve finally looked like himself again. No arrogance, no walls, just Steve. And for the first time in the entire story, he allowed himself to be completely honest. He told Claire that Chris had kept his promise, that he had come for her. And then, he told her he loved her. It's one of the most heartbreaking moments in Resident Evil history, because after everything Steve had endured, after everything he had lost, and after years believing nobody cared about him, he had finally found someone worth trusting, someone worth fighting for, and someone worth loving. And just as he had found that person, his story tragically came to an end. Steve died at only 17 years old. Shortly afterward, Albert Wesker's organization recovered Steve's body and extracted samples of the T. Veronica virus. And in the end, Steve never got the future he deserved. He never got the chance to leave his past behind. He never got the chance to discover who he could have become. But despite everything that was taken from him, Steve's story isn't remembered because of how it ended. It was remembered because of how much he changed. That lonely, bitter boy who arrived on Rockfort Island, believing nobody could be trusted, was gone. In his place was someone who had learned to trust again, to care again, and to hope again.